Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 48th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today, we have a discussion about COVID-19, climate change, and the Green New Deal with Billy Fleming, Kate Marvel, and Franco Montalto. You can catch COVID calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube. Just go to the COVID calls YouTube channel to watch. You can hear COVID calls recorded as podcasts on soundcloud.com. You can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVIDCalls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and topics, and please do feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. On Thursday, I will talk about COVID-19 in Singapore with Dr. Zulfikar Amir of Nanyang Technological University. As of today, there are 4,952,139 confirmed cases of COVID-19 globally, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. That's up from 4,872,308 cases yesterday. 1,539,633 of those are in the United States, up from 1,520,029 yesterday. There are now a total of 92,712 deaths from COVID-19 reported in the United States, up from 91,187 reported yesterday. As a way to bring some humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story every day, and I'd like to continue that now. Headline: for 25 years, he cared for Austin nursing home patients. This is an obituary that appeared April 21st, 2020 in the Austin American Statesman by Tony Plohetsky. Maurice Dotson updated his Facebook profile picture March 19th with what would become a haunting message: "I can't stay home, I'm a healthcare worker." For 25 years, he worked at West Oaks Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in South Austin as a certified nursing assistant. He never let a resident's birthday or other milestone go uncelebrated, and especially doted on those whose families lived away or seldom visited. He was the type he didn't just leave at the end of his shift, said Mona Serber, who became friends with Dotson on the job 8 years ago. He went and told every single resident on that hall, "I'm leaving. Good night. Do you need anything before I leave?" And that was every single night, every single night. As COVID-19 began spreading across Austin last month, and as patients in the facility where he worked became victims, Dotson weighed risks to his health and not going to work. He and Serber talked or texted almost daily, and he insisted his priority was his patients. He would tell me, "I know it's out there, but I have to work, and I'm not going to leave my residents," she said. Nurse Brian Zekin, one of Dotson's friends and a former West Oaks co-worker, said, "I think for him, that would have been like abandoning his family." As he pressed forward, Dotson told a couple of friends that he had begun to not feel well. On the morning of April 9th, Dotson, described by loved ones as a healthy 51-year-old with no underlying conditions, again posted on Facebook. He reported that he felt so sick that he had called an ambulance to take him to St. David's South Austin Medical Center. He became what is believed to be the first healthcare worker in Austin, Texas, to die from the virus. Austin health officials said that, as in many cities nationally, nursing homes, assisted living centers, and other long-term care facilities have especially suffered in the coronavirus crisis. 8 operations are linked to clusters of the virus where multiple patients have been diagnosed. Those who knew Dotson said he never sought employment elsewhere because he considered West Oaks a second home and the patients and staff a second family. His sister, Felicia Dotson, said he helped raise her and a younger sister. The family moved from Arkansas to Denton in North Texas in the late 1980s. She said her brother had a friend in Austin and decided to move to the larger city in the early 90s. Zekin said providing such intimate care never dampened Dotson's enthusiasm, nor did seeing many of the patients with whom he developed close relationships pass away. He was a very proud nurse's assistant, which is to be complimented, he said. The majority of all patient care happens at that level. So for somebody to keep a positive, upbeat attitude after doing it for decades is amazing. That speaks a lot to his character. After learning her brother was ill, Felicia Dotson said she kept in touch with doctors and nurses as his condition worsened. She was discouraged from coming to Austin to be with him because of the chance of getting sick herself. She updated his friends on Facebook. He is fighting, and we need true prayers for him right now, she wrote April 11th. COVID-19 has hit home. Over the next couple of days, she said Dotson seemed to improve, then took a turn. In their small hometown in Arkansas, she said she is now making plans for his funeral and taking comfort that he died from caring for others. How I have made peace with it is that he died doing what he loved, and that's helping other people, she said. Zekin, who had been in near constant touch with Dotson's other close friends, said he got a call in the middle of the night that he had died. As he drove to work at a dialysis clinic before dawn that morning, Zekin said he wiped away tears thinking about his friend's sacrifice. People tried to add meaning to a passing, but he went in knowing there was a good chance he would get it, he said. In a lot of ways, for me, he was a hero. Let's turn to our discussion for today. Let me introduce my guests. Billy Fleming is research coordinator for the Ian L. McHarg Center at the University of Pennsylvania's Stuart Weitzman School of Design. Most recently, he co-authored the Indivisible Guide and co-created Data Refuge, an international consortium of scientists, librarians, and programmers working to preserve the vital environmental data at risk of erasure during the Trump administration. Before coming to Penn, Fleming worked on urban policy development in the White House Domestic Policy Council during the Obama administration. Kate Marble is a climate scientist at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies and Columbia University, where she uses supercomputers, big data, and satellite observations to study climate change. Before becoming a climate scientist, Kate received a PhD in theoretical particle physics from Cambridge University, where she was a Gates Scholar. She teaches in Columbia's Climate and Society Master's Program and writes for Scientific American and other popular outlets. Our third guest is Franco Montalto. Franco is a professor of civil, architectural, and environmental engineering and director of the Sustainable Water Resource Engineering Lab at Drexel University in Philadelphia. He's also the director of the North American Hub of the Urban Climate Change Research Network and founder and president of eDesign Dynamics, LLC, an environmental consulting firm based in New York City. Dr. Montalto's research includes effects of built infrastructure on societal water needs, eco-hydrologic patterns and processes, ecological restoration, green design, and water interventions. Billy, Kate, and Franco, thank you for joining me on COVID Calls today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
I want to remind people that you can get in questions basically any way you want to. You can put them into the YouTube live chat. You can put them on Twitter. Just be sure to tag me at US of Disaster. And you can, some people like to email them to me directly during the program, and you can do that. My email is sgk23@drexel.edu. So please do get the questions in early. So I start these conversations always just by getting a sense of how people are doing and how things are, where they are. So why don't I start, Kate, can I start with you? Where are you calling in from and how are things going there?
Calling in from New York City. It is dystopian here, but you know, we are fortunate, we are healthy in my family, still employed. So that's something to be very grateful for. I was so glad that you read that obituary of that beautiful life, because I think it really, really brings home that this isn't just about numbers. This is about real people. And I think in New York, we're really seeing that.
Billy, same question to you. Where are you calling in from and how are things where you are?
All right, well, I'm just down the road from you in Philadelphia, or in South Philly. Things are okay. My partner and I both actually had lab positive tests for coronavirus. She got off very light with a kind of a modest cough. I had a pretty rough, like 10 days or so back in early April, but am almost back to 100%. And I'm back at work, obviously. So we're doing about as well as anyone can right now. Still have jobs, don't have anything to worry about, like with our house or food or anything. And I would just echo Kate's comment. You know, too often these kinds of, well, not that we have a lot of experience with pandemics, but too often crises and disasters become abstractions. And the very real, like, human suffering and misery that accompanies them gets flattened. And so I really appreciated us sort of starting this conversation by digging into, an experience that was very idiosyncratic for that person, but that was being felt by lots of people.
I'm glad you're doing okay, by the way. And thank you for
Thanks,
sharing.
I am too.
I'm sure you are. Thanks for sharing through that.
Yeah, my father, who is in his late 60s and still smokes a pack a day, and I were like breathing at the same interval for a while there. We were both wheezing every time we like moved around. So, and all in the scheme of things, I got off very light, but was not a fun experience.
I'm sure not. Franco, what about you?
Yeah, I'm also right here in South Philly, right down the street from you. Fortunately, we're doing well at the moment. We've got 3 kids who are being homeschooled and who are working on Chromebook computers provided by the Board of Education for the city of Philadelphia. I'm teaching online. It's been, it's been a challenging time. I echo what the others said about that particular obituary. The idea of a nursing home has hit home kind of closely, because we've lost some folks in our family who are New York City folks. That's where I'm from originally. Families from. So it's challenging times. We count our blessings, and I'm glad to be part of this discussion and have actually used COVID. COVID has sort of revolutionized the type of work that I'm doing. All of a sudden, a lot of the research that I'm doing is COVID related. In fact, just before this, I was on a webinar focusing on extreme heat and COVID, because as you may know, we're projected to have a higher than normal temperatures this summer. And with social distancing criteria in place, there's a real question as to how people will cool off, given that libraries and senior centers and pools, could all be closed. So COVID is sort of, even though I'm a water guy by training, COVID has sort of impacted a lot of the work that I do professionally as well.
Well, thank you each for your introductions, and I can't wait to talk about your research. I think the 3 of you each have, we're in the same domain, but have different enough research, and we're going to learn a lot today. I'd like to start, actually, Kate. The first question I'm going to give to you, and I'm going to want to just give a brief quote from a paper that was published in Nature yesterday. Just a couple lines from it. This is a paper by Le Carré et al. Lots of different authors on this one. And this is just, it says, government policies during the COVID-19 pandemic have drastically altered patterns of energy demand around the world. Many international borders were closed and populations were confined to their homes, which reduced transport and changed consumption patterns. Daily CO2 emissions decreased on average 17%, between 11 to 25%, it says, by early 2020, compared with the mean 2019 levels, just under half from changes in surface transport. At their peak, emissions in individual countries decreased by 26% on average. This is just the most recent report that we've seen. There's been a lot of reporting about reduced greenhouse gas emissions right now. So how real are these numbers? How important are these numbers? Can you help contextualize these kind of findings for us in this moment? Because it sounds pretty dramatic, but I don't know what to make of it.
So the short answer, I think, is real, but not important yet. I think it is true that changing consumption patterns, changing economic patterns have led to decreases in carbon dioxide emissions. But I think the thing to remember about carbon dioxide is that it lasts a really long time in the atmosphere. And so what we care about is cumulative carbon dioxide emissions. So stopping adding to a giant pile of carbon dioxide piling up in the atmosphere, a temporary stop to that isn't really going to matter in the long term. So I think what's really important for curbing catastrophic climate change is actually not my domain. It's actually Billy's domain. It's actually people who are thinking about policy, people who are thinking about how we design systems. How do we take these carbon dioxide emissions and transform them into something sustainable? How do we take this drop and make it sustainable? And is there any relationship? Can we learn anything from human behavior now And can we learn anything going forward? I think that's the really, really important question. Something that I do want to point out that I think gets conflated a lot in some of the reporting about this is that we've seen a drop in carbon dioxide emissions, but we've also seen a drop in what we call aerosol pollution. So basically the stuff that we like to think of as pollution, the stuff that blocks sunlight, the stuff that makes bad air quality days, essentially. And we've seen a drop in that. And that stuff matters a lot, and that stuff is different than carbon dioxide because that stuff doesn't stay in the atmosphere for quite as long. And I think there are things that we can learn scientifically for that, but as opposed, like the question of whether those things are sustainable, that's something that is kind of beyond the domain of physics.
Well, you're a science communicator, Kate. So, I mean, what you've just described actually sounds like it might be a little complicated as a message. I mean, you've delivered it well, but is it hard for people? Is it hard for people to hear that? Because a lot of the reporting has your conflation. I agree. It's been like greenhouse gas emissions are down, and also the skies are clearer, and I don't hear airplanes all the time. And look, there's ducks in the park. It's kind of a mashup of environmental effects that are all in one paragraph, sometimes in a news piece. Does that pose a problem to you as a science communicator?
I don't think so, because I think most people intuitively understand pandemics suck, lockdowns suck. This is not what we want to do. This is not a blueprint for long-term solutions. This is fundamentally, I think, not sustainable. Nobody wants to stay inside their house all day. Nobody wants to be driven inside by a very real fear of a global pandemic. And I think that's something that's really, really intuitive to people. And that's something when we sort of message about this, when we talk about the connections between something like the coronavirus crisis and climate, we need to be really careful not to fall into a trap where we're going to be accused, I think, by people acting in bad faith of saying, oh, this is an opportunity. This is what climate action looks like. And to me, this is not what climate action should look like, because it's fundamentally unsustainable.
Billy, can I just bring that same question to you, both in terms of the science, but also in terms of this opportunity to communicate with people? I mean, it's a real finding, and yet it carries with it certain concerns, like Kate said.
Yeah, well, first, I think Kate is exactly right. I think anyone who's trying to sort of model or pilot climate action as being representative of what this moment is and feels like is making a huge mistake. Thankfully, we haven't seen a ton of that. We've seen it mostly in bad faith efforts on the right, from people who are opposed to climate action anyway. But I tend to think of this as like one in a sort of litany or a long list of sort of profound economic restructuring moments and societal restructuring moments in the country. And I think often we're faced with kind of a false choice here about whether to sort of rebound or bounce back to some sort of pre-disaster state, sort of a pre-pandemic world, which I think anyone who tried to say that with a straight face in most rooms would be laughed out of the room, hopefully. Because there is really no going back. There is a new world like to be built and to be restructured after this. And the choices before us now are like, what are the shape and content and form of like that future world? And hopefully all of those choices are well informed by science and well informed by evidence and information. But I think we're coming to a moment now where we have to make a choice about what that restructuring looks like. And the argument I've tried to put forward with lots of other collaborators in many other places, and that we're seeing, I think, begin to kind of echo and reverberate through the climate movement more broadly, both from like the wonk world and the activist world and kind of everyone in between, is to think about our response to the pandemic when we get to a point where it is time for most people to go back to work, which we're not at yet, even if most people are beginning to go back to work. It's incredibly unsafe for most people to be doing that. But when we get to that point where, say, the WHO and the CDC give us the all clear, they say like social distancing is ready to be eased back and it's time to sort of restart the economy. I think we have to start to think about what that stimulus measure is, which we can differentiate from, say, a recovery or bailout measure, which we're kind of actively sort of passing and living with right now. We can think about those stimulus measures as like a down payment on a decarbonized and just future. And like anyone imagines that, say, phase 5, 6, or 7 of the congressional talks that lead to this back to work stimulus bill give us all the things we might want in something like a Green New Deal or something like sort of climate forward infrastructure plan. But what they can do is, at the very least, avoid locking in all of the worst case scenarios. And there's a lot to learn, and we can get into this if you want to in the conversation. I think from the 2009 stimulus experience, it was not there for its passage, but was in the administration for its implementation. There have been lots, I think, of sort of great analyses of what worked and what did not work well from that moment. And we can start to sort of carry, hopefully, some of those lessons forward into how we think about crafting the kind of back to work, reopening the economy phase of the pandemic recovery, weeks and months, and probably realistically years from now.
I definitely want to circle back to this issue about the stimulus bill and the Green New Deal. I just want to, so I'm going to put a pin in that. Franco, I just want to stick with the science here for just a minute. And again, these kind of news reports that we've seen, and you were co-author last week. We were co-authors of a piece that appeared in American Scientist, but I want to read one of the lines that I know you wrote. And you said, "We do not want to confuse the consequences of a temporary pause in consumer economies with the structural changes needed to avoid the most devastating effects of climate change. That goal requires," you said, "a similar reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, about 7.6% every year between 2020 and 2030. And that reduction must be accompanied by equally ambitious efforts to promote social justice and equity." So if you would, I mean, sort of take us into, again, some of the opportunities and yet challenges in this moment in terms of educating people. People do have a question, like, do these emission decreases really matter? And if not, in the way we did, what do they mean to us? What kind of response do you give?
Well, I mean, I would sort of reference an intergovernmental panel on climate change report back in 2018 that was looking at what's required to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. In other words, and that would be by limiting global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees C. And there's a really interesting report. There's lots of stuff in there. And that report warns that if we don't look at climate action in a broader context that includes sustainable development, there are a series of trade-offs that we could inadvertently sort of call. And, so some of the things that were referenced by the previous speakers are perfect examples of that, where, yes, we got emissions reductions, but at huge social and economic cost. And so that's not the way. That's exactly what that IPCC report is sort of warning against. That's not the way to get emissions reductions. And you're not going to sustain those emissions reductions at the level, as referenced in our American Scientist piece. We would need to get these levels of emissions reductions every year for the next 10 years. So of course, the way we got them this time, we don't want to keep getting them this time. And so there's some doubling back that's going to have to occur. And the question, I think, as Billy put, is, well, what are we, what is that response? What is that reconstruction going to look like? What are we going to do? I think that we're still, we may not be traveling, to and from work, but we're still living at home and we're still consuming electricity, and our electricity is still coming from the same power plants that it was coming from before. So when we talk about structural change, I mean, we haven't fundamentally altered the way that we are generating electricity overnight. We may be consuming less electricity, in certain ways, but there's a broader discussion about how our entire sort of economic system, the supply chain, our institutions, our governance mechanisms, our sort of rules of participation and inclusion are in line. And unless, and I think that's, going back to this question of trade-offs, I mean, that if we don't think about this in a broader way, then we run the risk of sort of one problem being addressed and another problem being created. And, as I mentioned, I was in this webinar earlier today looking at the impacts of extreme heat. And the mayor of New York, for example, is now giving out 74,000 air conditioners to low income and minority populations, which is great, because if you look at, sustainable development goal that focuses on equity, and you look at climate, you're saying, well, you don't want to have this double whammy where the most vulnerable people who were hit by COVID are also now hit by extreme heat because they can't get into cooling centers this summer. So that's an interesting marrying of two goals. But there are so many other goals associated with that. So if we're increasing energy demand at the same time, office parks are still running air conditioners, even if there's nobody there. And people are now running air conditioners at home, the people who have the means to be able to run those air conditioners. There's sort of non-trivial impacts on peak demand, and there could be brownouts, there could be a whole bunch of situations. So to me, this question, about what to do really needs to, we need the emissions reductions, but we need them via a very different pathway than the one we've just taken.
So what are the opportunities, Billy, at this particular moment? You mentioned the 2009 stimulus package, and now we have, this moment in time in which there is a pretty fundamental set of questions being asked about what the economy will look like and what might look like coming out of this. What kind of answers do you give from your perspective? No, we can't shut down the economy for 10 years to reach the emissions goals we need to reach. It has to come via a different way. What is that different way? Give us some examples.
Yeah, so we can begin, I think, just by sort of looking at the 2009 stimulus package and like what it did. And Reed Hunt has an excellent book called The Crisis Wasted that really, I think, walks through some of the sort of political economy analysis of this in interesting ways. Reed he was on the transition team, he was around the administration at the time, and then wrote this really scathing book, I think, about the limits of what that stimulus provided. And I think ultimately he sort of comes down on the side that I tend to agree with, that that stimulus package was way too small. So it's less than $1 trillion. We've already spent, 7-8 times that this year already between the Fed and between actual stimulus appropriations from Congress. It was a one-time shot, so we got one bite at the apple that time, and that was it. And that it was way, way, way too targeted towards the 1% and towards big business, and not. There's a reason why. I think, thankfully, what we've seen happen already during this crisis is that mortgage payments have been essentially deferred. Not all rent, but many renters across the country have had kind of a sort of rent holiday or a suspension of rent payments. Certainly, there have been eviction moratoria in cities all over the country, although many of those are now expiring and not being extended. The sort of line from the Obama administration in 2009, where those things were too hard to do. Like, we could not figure out how to suspend mortgage payments. We could not figure out how to suspend evictions. And already cities and states have figured out ways to do some of the latter, and already Congress has provided more money. And so I think, as we get into what a green stimulus or a stimulus that, puts jobs and infrastructure and sort of people first might look like, there are a lot of lessons we can take from that. One is that I think, there's a need for automatic stabilizers so that we can take some of the sort of congressional politics out of, future stimulus discussions. And when I say automatic stabilizer, this is a word that economists tend to throw around. All it really means is that if we were to set a couple of benchmarks, say, getting back to 3.5% unemployment, and as we sort of highlight in the green stimulus letter we put forward, also totally decarbonizing the economy, then until both of those things are true, that something like 4% of GDP would be appropriated for climate and infrastructure projects for the foreseeable future. That's basically a way of saying we're going to set aside $1 trillion or so a year for climate action that isn't already happening until we fully decarbonize the economy. That's one thing we can think about. The other, and this is a thing that I've always really appreciated about science communicators in general, and Kate in particular, is the focus on not just storytelling, but moving beyond the molecules and electrons of climate change, which are hugely important, but we're not going to get on a Zoom chat like this and notice that our computer is powered by wind instead of coal. It should be, but there's not yet anyway. Lenovo has not installed an app that tells me where my electricity is coming from. But they are going to notice when they walk into their house and all of a sudden their gas stove is replaced by a hyper efficient conduction electric stove. The same for all of the appliances in their house. They are going to notice when their commute to and from work is powered by an electric vehicle that was incredibly cheap for them to buy because the tax credits have been tuned way the hell up, or because they're getting on a low or no carbon bus or train, for their commute. they are going to notice when all of the public space that like now has become hugely important to everyone's everyday life as they're cloistered away in their homes, is getting like the bulk of the sort of public works and infrastructure investment, as opposed to sort of building roads to exurbia and other kinds of like sprawl-induced infrastructure that actually winds up locking in a lot of carbon emissions. And I say that I was excited to hear the narrative in lots of ways that you opened us with, because it pointed back to Arkansas, which is where I'm from. So I always like to hear things about Arkansas. This is like a thing you're required to do when you're from the state and you go like give a talk like this. You have to say the state's name like 5 times. But you know, like there are lots of ways we can imagine a stimulus package that's focused on buildings and landscapes and parks and civic infrastructure like schools and libraries and sidewalks that aren't like the sexy high-speed rail projects that tend to get bandied about into space, but that are ultimately like the things that shape our everyday lives for most people, whether you're living in a big city or a small town, whether you're on a coast or you're living like in the Mid-South or the heartland. Those are things that tend to, that where we have a shameful sort of deferred maintenance and investment backlog, and where we know we can create lots of jobs for people whose work is probably not coming back post-pandemic. Because there are lots of firms, lots of companies who I think some people imagine might just sort of magically reappear if and when we get the all clear to go back to work. And that seems incredibly unrealistic to me. So thinking about targeting the kind of economy that we want to build around these things that are much more oriented towards like public luxury as opposed to private luxury have to be the core of any real stimulus strategy.
Kate, I'm going to bring that to you. I mean, do you have anything you want to add to that? Or, you know, when Billy said you get asked difficult science questions, you have a good way of pivoting to communicating that in ways that people can actually think of in terms of action. Do you?
Yeah.
How do you? Tell us how you do it.
I mean, I feel like the thing that I have seen people realize over the past couple of years with Fridays for Future, with Greta Thunberg, with, you know, the release of the 1.5 degree report that was mentioned. I think there's this real realization that, oh, this was never about polar bears. And like, I love polar bears. I get hate mail whenever I say that. Like, polar bears are great. I don't know any personally, but pro polar bear. But this realization that, oh, this is about people. This is about me. This is about my life. And I think what I have seen, and what I like, the thing that I loved about what Billy said is that often you hear climate discussions very much couched in language of scolding and shaming and sacrifice. And this argument that everything has to change. If we don't do anything, everything will change. We'll experience really catastrophic climate changes. So since everything has to change, let's choose the change that we want to see. And that can actually be really joyful, really fun. We can have awesome things. We can have better lives. And I think that is a message that's really resonating with people. And it's not, and I know that there are certain actors who want to make the message, you're being scolded, you're being shamed, you're going to have to give up your hamburgers or whatever. But I really, and I love the concept of public luxury versus private luxury. But I think those are the kind of things that I'm really hopeful about, that people are awakening to the fact that this is not about electrons. This is not about molecules, except the ones that make us up. Not about polar bears. It's about us.
There's been a couple. I'm glad you put it into that frame, and I want to get your take on this. One of the things that's really struck me, and Franco and I talked about this a lot too, is that in the midst of this pandemic, I have been really astounded by the helping and by the fact that, and I know we hear about people at state houses with guns and various things that are real in our society, and certain parts of the country of people eager to get out and get a haircut. Okay. But much of the country went inside and stayed inside and stopped doing what people wanted to do. Those who had the luxury to stop doing that without losing their jobs, I should say. But most people did it because a health official said, you know, trust the science, take care of yourself. And the greater impact of that was not just for themselves, but for people they will never meet. I was really impressed by that. I want to think about how you can mobilize that that finding. I mean, it's a real strong collective action. I mean, it's the kind of collective action that we would think might be at the heart of real climate action too. The thing connected with that is also just at a moment when we were told there's no way a scientist could convince anybody of anything. Tony Fauci gets on TV and says, you know, you should think about doing this. And he's standing next to the president of the United States, who oftentimes was saying, ostensibly, don't listen to this scientist. And people mostly listen to the scientists. So I don't know if any of that resonates for you in terms of possibilities in this moment where people realize we can do things that we didn't think we could do.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I'd be really curious to get your take as a historian on this. But for me, one of the things that I find really frustrating is kind of a doomist narrative that's tied to human nature. And I think people who are talking about human nature as a single immutable thing don't know about nature. So that really bothers me. So I tend to be kind of allergic to these arguments that we can never solve climate change because we're all terrible. And this is just our punishment for being terrible. And I see that a little bit reflected in some of the media coverage of, especially the protesters. You know, these people, they're really noisy, they have guns, and they're getting a lot of press coverage. And some of that does sort of feed back into this narrative of we deserve what we get because we're terrible. And I actually don't think people are terrible. Like, if you think people are terrible, you're probably hanging out with the wrong people. So, you know, for me, I think you have to be very careful about sort of reductive narratives. Either all people are terrible or all people are good, because people are really complicated. You know, we all contain multitudes. So you know, that's sort of one lesson that's been reinforced by this, is sort of beware of reductive narratives. I also think, you know, if you look at the polling, scientists are actually pretty trusted when we talk about science. We're pretty popular. I think the narrative that everybody hates scientists is really blown out of proportion by the fact that, and trust me, people do hate scientists. They write me emails all the time. They are very loud. They do have very strong opinions, but that's not necessarily representative of the country or the world.
Mm-hmm. I want to come to you, Franco. I know that you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals a minute ago, and in the conversations that you and I have had about this, you pointed something out to me that I hadn't thought of, which is that to understand the impacts, the differential impacts of the pandemic, the fact that it doesn't affect people the same all over the world, and that's also how we should be thinking about climate change. In other words, when we talk about climate change impacts as a nation, we are missing the fact that we're not really talking about the nation. We're talking about groups of people within a nation, and there's injustices there. How does that, I want to get you to talk a little bit about that and some of your thinking there, and how that might connect to the Sustainable Development Goals, things that are already been established in the discussion about climate change adaptation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. The people who were disproportionately impacted by COVID, who are disproportionately impacted by COVID, are the same sort of vulnerable populations, more or less, that were disproportionately impacted, as you know, by other disasters. And so climate, so to some extent, watching the COVID pandemic play out is sort of indicative of how the climate crisis will play out. You know, those who can afford to adapt or move or improve their situation will do so. Those who have no other choice but to continue sort of plugging away will be on the front lines. And so, you know, that reality, I think, is a sort of a call to action, that if we don't address some of the structural inequities and deficiencies in our system, the fact that there are losers and winners, the fact that there are marginalized and empowered, you know, if we don't address some of these broader issues, you know, climate, just like COVID, will have a disproportionate impact on certain vulnerable populations. And then we will be sitting here again saying, look at that. Once again, you know, it's low income and minority populations and developing countries and blah, blah, blah. It's the same narrative. We have to learn from this. We you know, and I say that knowing it's not easy to learn from this and it's not easy to make those changes. I think the sustainable development goals are really interesting to me because a lot of people, you know, when faced with this reality, sort of scratch their head and say, well, what are you going to do? I mean, you know, what do you want? I mean, this is the way life is. But the reality is that, you know, all of the signatories to the UN agreement have signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 goals, and those goals are, you know, exactly the types of things that we need. So a roadmap, there is a global roadmap for what we would ideally be, you know, be undertaking in some kind of post-COVID, post-pandemic, let's call it post-global pandemic, sort of restructuring, reshuffling of our priorities. I wanted to just attack, you know, go back to some of the topics that were mentioned by the other two speakers. You know, there are folks who are out of work and who need work, and there's work to be done. And there's a lot of work to be done. And the work that needs to be done is innovative, and it's decentralized, and it's in multiple sectors, especially if you look at and take seriously all the different sort of dimensions of the you know, the Sustainable Development Goals. And so, you know, to me, there seems to be the opportunity to marry those who are looking at the pandemic as an economic crisis principally. Maybe they weren't impacted personally through sickness or death by somebody who, you know, through the virus itself, but they were impacted economically, and they see this, and that those are the voices that are calling, you know, we have to go right back to work right now. We need to, you know, the real problem here is jobs. And the other folks who are on the front lines and who say, yet again, you know, we're getting the bleep end of the stick, and, you know, nothing ever changes. And so if we want to restructure things and address these sort of two components of our society, those who, you know, want structural change and those who really want a sound economy to be rebuilt post-pandemic, you know, I think there's some really interesting ways of thinking about that. How do you put people to work doing the types of things that we want? And I can just give you an example from my own research. We got a NSF RAP award to look at in 40 parks in New York City, 20 parks in New York City and Philadelphia. How people are using parks in the COVID era. You know, we're interested in whether people are getting exposed to or engaging in activities that put them at higher risk of exposure to COVID, or whether they're really, the parks are serving this sort of palliative role. You know, people feel better, you know, going into nature. They're isolated at home. This allows them to go out. And so to conduct this research, rather than sending academic researchers out into the field, we decided to actually recruit unemployed individuals and pay them in, you know, using a sort of smartphone-based survey to conduct this work. And we pay them, you know, we're paying them, you know, if we put them all together, we're paying up to $40,000 over the next 8 weeks to about 40 individuals who are collecting data for us. And I think there's a whole bunch of sort of creative ways of thinking about this, creative ways of addressing the economic impacts of this crisis and addressing the work that needs to be done. And I'll just mention, you know, Senator Coons has this bill, this proposal for a National Service Act, where he's proposing to massively increase jobs like AmeriCorps and Peace Corps, volunteer corps around the country to get people doing, especially, I mean, think about university students. There are all this whole flock of students who are graduating from high school and graduating from university and don't have any idea where they're going to get employment. Let's put them to work in service of the greater good. And, you know, I think that's just a really interesting direction that's going.
I want to remind people that you're listening to COVID Calls, and my discussion today is with Billy Fleming and Kate Marble and Franco Montalto. We're talking about Green New Deal, climate change, and COVID-19. Billy, since the conversation has turned to politics, and specifically, maybe we can talk a little bit about this upcoming election. What should well, I'm most interested to know what Joe Biden should take away from this conversation we're having today, but maybe you don't want to advise him. But what should the parties, what should the Democratic Party, what should activists more generally be messaging right now in terms of, you know, the kinds of narratives they need to tell? Franco has just given us one. We have people out of work. That's a moment in which we need to be fair, we need to be just, we also need to seize opportunities that are there. That's one type of message. What are some of the ones you think will work? I guess I'm asking you to be an advisor here and give me some free political advice. So I'm not running for anything, so.
Not yet, anyway. That'll be next cycle for you, Scott. So I think there's a couple things. One, like I think on the activist and frontline community side, like they know like the stories to tell better than I do. So I'm not going to pretend to like know what the right message is for them. But I think, you know, I've been interested to see now that every couple of weeks there's a big splashy piece that's placed by the Biden campaign in like a legacy magazine about how he wants an FDR scale presidency, which is quite different than like primary campaign candidate Joe Biden and general election candidate Joe Biden. Almost all that is a function of circumstance. But I think, you know, to sort of point back to some of Franco's points, I think we actually have to choose between like economy and like justice and quality of life and climate. Like not only can we do all of those things in the same kind of investment package or policy instruments, but we kind of have to. We're not going to get very far if the kinds of things we're pouring money into are only accomplishing one of those goals at a time. And so Senator Coon's bill is great. There's also, I mean, different proposals for a jobs guarantee led by Derek Hamilton and others for a long time, and making the federal government an employer of last resort, which, as you can imagine, at a time like this would mean it's a very large employer. And at times like we sort of experienced maybe 6-8 months ago with 3.5% unemployment, it's a very sort of low or sort of very small workforce. But there are a couple of things to think about. And one is, you know, you're an historian, so you already know this, but, you know, public health crises and built environment professions have merged together after moments like this before. And, you know, I think thinking about a physical built environment response to a public health crisis, which is what we're living through, is not a new idea. It's what gave us our sanitary sewer systems. It's what gave us our lazarettos that ships used to have to quarantine at before they would come into port. It's given us lots of other things that we sort of take for granted in the sort of shape and experience of our communities. The same is true for the New Deal, right? So this is the central reference of the Green New Deal and the New Deal seriously. And we tend to remember it for its sort of universal programs like Social Security. But it also was a sort of transformative package of investments in the built and natural environment. It builds something like 55,000 physical projects in real places all over the country in the span of about 10 years. And they include, you know, almost our entire state park infrastructure. So like 90% of all the state parks ever developed were developed during the New Deal by the CCC and WPA, PWA, and others. We get about 42% of all the electric transmission lines ever built in the history of the United States by the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, during the New Deal. We get about half the trees ever planted in the history of the US over the course of the New Deal. And we get our entire municipal airport infrastructure out of the New Deal. Those are things, right, with like pretty high carbon legacies in some ways. Like the REA was building, you know, power plants and lines that were powered by coal, and in some cases still are. The Civil Aeronautics Authority, which became the FAA that we know today, you know, was giving us airports, which are a very, you know, sort of huge carbon production or huge carbon source. But you can think about, you know, I think we have to think about, you know, investments that put people to work, that stitch together our communities, and that, you know, accomplish all of these goals around climate at the same time, which are fundamentally about decarbonization. And, you know, I think just to kind of come back to a couple points I made earlier, one is that like a lot of the jobs that have been lost to this are not coming back. We're going to see, you know, on the private firm side, lots of firms never recover from this. We're going to see lots of restaurants and bars never recover from this. And if our plan is to like not have a plan, let the market decide what happens to those people, then we sort of know like what the shape of that recovery is going to look like. It's going to be non-existent for most of them, or it's going to be a very long time. And if we think about, you know, a sort of stimulus program that's focused on building lots of new things that might not accomplish a lot of the goals that we want to accomplish with a stimulus package, You can put people to work, like clearing the backlog of maintenance projects on things that aren't super sexy, like in political terms. I can't imagine Mayor Kenny here in Philly like showing up for a sidewalk repair, like ribbon cutting. He might for like a high-speed rail like cutting, but that's a 30-year like time horizon to build a segment of high-speed rail. Maintenance and repair projects put somewhere between 15 and 20% more people to work per dollar spent than a new capital construction project. So I mean, I think for me anyway, like those are the highlights you want to hit. Like, what are the things that are going to do the most good for the most people economically? What are the things that are going to get us on the shortest path possible to a sort of decarbonized economy? And what are the things that we can do that put, frontline communities, which we can think of broadly as like basically folks who are left out of markets, which is like most people for the most part, or a lot of people. How do we put them at the front of the line in terms of prioritizing that round of investment? And so, you can listen to that or not. But I think if his campaign is serious about an FDR-sized presidency, then it has to also be serious about combining this climate and infrastructure and economy question into a coherent package of ideas that he can run.
That's interesting that so much of what you just said in your first observation, that the central sort of premises of the campaign are so different from the primary to as we move into now. I mean, even, he was saying, I'm the least radical, I'm the most conservative of all these Democrats up here, you know me the best. And now the language is quite different. I think also that sort of talking about the New Deal in this way, it's probably malpractice for a historian to say this. It definitely is. I'll say it anyway, that I think if there had been environmentally sustainable infrastructure options known to the Roosevelt administration, they would have pursued those. I mean, there was sort of a sense of conservation at that time with this raft of different kinds of choices. I think they would have pursued the more sustainable options. And so I think that's not unthinkable right now to marry those two concepts. I don't think you have to say that we can't have a New Deal and also have it be focused in environmental sustainability. In the time we have left here, what's that?
Can I just add something real quick there?
Please.
I mean, I think the, in the discussion about which infrastructure or which works, which construction projects, I mean, there are some key tipping points that I think just need to be called out, like public transit. Public transit is at great risk, and public transit is a key component to our climate future, but also a key, it's key to cities and all of the efficiencies that occur because we have vibrant cities, and it's key to equity. And so there are a few sort of nodes, and I think green spaces is a perfect example. I mean, it emerged, during the Roosevelt administration, and it's emerged. It's very prominent today. Like, we talk about nature-based solutions to a lot of problems, and we've learned that there are so many efficiencies in using natural systems and using green spaces to protect our coast, to manage our stormwater, to reduce our temperatures, to create, to improve our property values, to enhance our public experience, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like, infrastructure is not infrastructure. There are, certainly we need the jobs, and certainly there's a lot of infrastructure, but there are key infrastructure systems where you can get, I think, bigger bang for your buck along, along this sort of this theme that I was talking about earlier of the Sustainable Development Goals. And another way of thinking about it would be just multifunctionality. We're trying to build infrastructure systems that give us multiple things that we need, and we can build the workforce at the same time.
So we got about 5 minutes left, and I've been asking people this question, and Kate, I want to talk to you just about the changes that the pandemic has caused in the way you do your work, if any. And I guess connected with that also is thinking about sort of aspiring scientists, people who are, maybe in high school or just starting college and coming into this moment. How you think this might impact them, what kind of advice you're giving people, particularly with the economy looking as it is. I mean, I guess my question is, how is your sort of world as a scientist changing right now?
I think the honest short answer to that is I am doing not great science right now, because it is very hard to do great science when you have a kid home from school running around making a lot of noise. I think, that has been a giant hit on my productivity. And also, not having my colleagues around to just bounce ideas off has been really difficult. I think kind of, the more sort of structural answer long-term going forward is, I worry that scientists might learn the wrong lesson from this crisis. And the wrong lesson might be science is great. It's enough to be right. Everybody just shut up and listen to us. And like, I love science. I think science is great. But I do think there's a danger in treating science as, and I think Franco and Billy have done a really, really good job of explaining sort of what the other areas of knowledge that we need to solve this problem. And so I think scientists need to get better at not just communicating, but listening. Scientists need to get better. And I think, as a physicist, we are trained to make scenarios, to draw boundaries around scenarios and say, there's no friction. Everything's a perfect sphere. What can we learn from that? And we can learn a lot from that. But we have to make sure when we do that, we're not creating completely artificial systems, right? So if we're saying, oh, all the atmosphere cares about is the chemistry, is the carbon dioxide concentration, to a certain extent, that's true. But the way that I change carbon dioxide concentrations in a climate model is I change a number in the run deck. And that's not how carbon dioxide changes in the real world. It changes due to a set of historical circumstances, a set of policy choices. And it goes down in the future because of those choices, because of pre-existing infrastructure, because of politics, because of what's possible. And I think as scientists, we need to start a dialogue with people who are not just scientists. And I think that's something that my students, at least, just sort of intuitively understand, that maybe has not penetrated into sort of academic, quote unquote, ivory tower science.
And your students in this particular moment, how are they feeling about, the career path that they've moved into?
I think they're graduating this year because it's a one-year master's program. And I think all students are just feeling really freaked out about the world they're going out into.
This, one of the things that you said really struck me too, that, talking about the way physics works with models. I feel like we're all getting a sort of real-time crash course in how to think about models. We've been inundated with public health models, for example, but I think also these climate models that we started our conversation with today, there's a lot of this information coming at us. The American public scientific literacy, it's a moving target. It's hard to say if it's low or high. I don't know, but when you try to communicate those very complex, again, ideas around the multiple, like bringing a model into the world, how does that communication work? Do you have
I mean, I would never presume to be the expert on it. I just shoot my mouth off all the time, and sometimes what I say lands. But I do think, sometimes people say, don't talk about uncertainty, because when you talk about uncertainty, it's immediately weaponized. But I want to talk about uncertainty because that's what I do all day. Like, that's the world that I live in. Like, who wants to talk about stuff that we've known since like 1896? It's boring. But the fact of the matter is, I think it's really imperative to stress that uncertainty and certainty can sort of coexist together. So, in epidemiological modeling, there's a whole bunch of stuff we don't know. This is a novel coronavirus. There's a lot that we don't know about how it works, but we know what a virus is. And we know that you're not going to be able to stop a virus spreading by yelling at it. That is the scientific consensus. So there's a lot of stuff we don't know, and there's a lot of gray area, and there's a lot of uncertainty, but there's also certainty. And I think with climate change, it's the same thing. Carbon dioxide has the molecular structure it has. It is a greenhouse gas. We know that. Nobody is, like, one dude is disputing that. Like, nobody seriously disputes that. But at the same time, there's a lot of uncertainty about what climate change means in the future. And I think for a long time, if we don't talk about uncertainty, then that gets seized upon. And it's like, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. And uncertainty is not comforting. It's actually totally terrifying, because if you knew exactly what was going to happen, so if you knew that, okay, there's going to be a giant drought in exactly this year, and then the subways are going to flood in this year on, March 24th, 2024, the subways are going to flood. If you had that specificity, you could make plans to deal with that. But we don't have that specificity, and we're never going to have that degree of specificity. And I think it's really, really important to talk about uncertainty so that people don't hear, okay, well, it could be bad, but it could be fine. And just say, look, like, we've ruled out fine. It's not going to be fine.
Really like the way you're talking about certainty and uncertainty and the ability of people to try to deal with both. I talked with Dan Zarilli, who is the climate change policy director for City of New York, a couple of weeks back, and he had I asked him a variant of that question, and his answer about the uncertainty and the weaponization of uncertainty was that, yeah, there's whole industries that have spent years trying to convince people that uncertainty is basically means that all that science is useless, instead of framing it just the way you did, which is that it's the unknown and uncertainty that drives. Otherwise, we'd just be reproving the same old things that we knew from the past. That's an important point to make. We're almost up on time. I want to get just a quick take on this from Billy. You're at a university. We're all three situated at universities, and we're just hearing from Kate about her students. I want to hear also from you, Billy, and from you, Franco. What's happening on campus? Well, nothing right now. No one's there, but the students are still active, I presume. What's the sense of students right now in terms of action? Is this a moment of student activism? We may not be able to see it on the campus, but give us a sort of read of how students see this moment.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'll say, so most of our students just graduated. Our school commencement at Penn was Saturday, and I think the university-wide commencement was Monday. And like Kate's students, I think they are rightfully filled with anxiety and stress about like the short, medium, and long-term future for themselves and for like everyone they care about and for like the world they care about. I think our placement rate is usually like 100% before graduation. For graduates, it's like 2% this year because literally no one is hiring. I have several students who are going to be working with me this summer who, had summer internships that were rescinded. If you look at the American Institute of Architects tracks, basically building contracts, so a sense of like how the industry is doing over time. And in 60 days of lockdown, we've reached the sort of same dip or same trough that we reached at the worst phase of the Great Recession. And who knows, like if or when it will recover. It never really recovered after 2009 or 10 within the industry. And so I think like they're rightfully freaking out. I would be if I were them. And I think in some ways like that anxiety and that grief and that stress can be channeled into like productive ends, but only to a point. I don't think we can expect like students who are dealing with all kinds of things on top of this like massive global economic crisis and health crisis. They all have like other shit going on in their lives that they were and are dealing with and will be dealing with that are like layered on top of this. And this is only making it worse. And I think this is, when I look for like parallels between, the climate crisis and this public health crisis, that's one where that's pretty obvious. I mean, the challenge for climate action has always been that it's like very, very, very diffuse in impact and hard to understand. Like I can't walk outside and see like carbon molecules pinging around off my face. And so I think like the same is true for this. Like they can't walk outside and like get a sense of like how the global economy or how the virus is doing based on like looking at things. And its effects are just so widespread and so amplified by all of the other precarities that sort of shape their everyday lives. That sounds like quite like dismal. And I'm very wary of becoming or sounding like doomerish about this, but it is very bleak for like students who are entering or trying to enter the job market, graduating from a university that is like, frankly, absurdly expensive and doesn't like offer a ton of aid to most of them who are graduating. So they're all saddled with tons of debt. And so, yeah, I mean, I think like the short version of this, or the TLDR of this is like they're rightfully panicking. Some of that will result, I think, in like interesting or productive work around like climate mobilization or whatever it might be in response to this. But a lot of it will just mean that like people drop out of the field. We saw this in 2009. I think architecture, landscape architecture, engineering often struggle to like figure out why they have so many women and people of color in their educational programs and so few in the workforce. And the answers are pretty obvious. Like one is that like often their like family leave policies and their benefit structure sucks in their corporate offices. The other is that crises like this tend to basically push lots of people out of the workforce. And if it's only your youngest or newest generation that is actually starting to be representative of like the world in which your field operates, those are the folks who get, you know, laid off first, and they might never come back.
Franco, the last word to you. We're kind of up on time, but I did want to get a sense of what you're seeing. The Urban Climate Change Research Network North American Hub is at Drexel. I know you've been involved working with students who've been pushing a sustainability pledge for Drexel.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, and I apologize. I got kicked out for a second, and I'm back in. So I don't know if some people said some things. I don't want to.
Well, we solved it, but we decided we'd stick around a couple minutes till you came back.
I just say, you know, this generation, right? They were born. The students who graduated this year were born right before 9/11. They went through the financial crisis, which, you know, the financial crash, which may have impacted their city, their families. You know, they've been exposed to divisive politics. They've been hearing about climate change, you know, and now the pandemic. And so, you know, I think it's easy for some of us to say, oh, this cynicism that I sense coming, where is it coming from? It's very clear where it's coming from. And, but on the other hand, I see another side to this. I see students yearning for purpose and meaning and sort of institutions that do the things that they know instinctively need to be done and have not been done. And like, you know, I can say that I've been involved with helping advise 2 student groups at Drexel, Fossil Free Drexel and the Drexel Sierra Club, who just before, you know, starting in, I think it was the end of February, we had just decided to do a series of, actually they had decided, and I was their advisor, of climate rallies. And we did the first one, we got 50 people. And then we did, you know, in March, we were not able to do it in person. So it turned into an online rally. And, you know, it's continued from there. And I'd say that there are student leaders and sort of rank and file members who are really pushing. And in many cases, I would say it's somewhat humiliating because it's students, you know, I know at Drexel in particular, a lot of the work pushing a sustainability office has been driven by an undergraduate student in particular who, you know, who's kind of leading by the nose the rest of us to make us do what we should be doing. But to me, that's also a source of optimism, you know, that I see students. I'm offering a course this summer about extreme precipitation and flooding. And I just thought, man, this is a new class. Who's going to be interested? It's already full. I've got 15 students already interested in this. And next year, you know, sort of riding this wave, next year, we've decided to make climate year at Drexel. And there are students, you know, there's all kinds of sort of projects emerging. And we've even got within the freshman curriculum in the College of Engineering, we're building a climate module into that. So I don't know, I see this, I see sort of gradual and but encouraging changes, and I see students leading, and I see them sort of asking the rest of us to, you know, to do what needs to be done. And I think it's time for us to do it.
You've been listening to COVID Calls. Tomorrow, my guest will be Zulfikar Amir. We're going to talk about the COVID-19 situation in Singapore. And you can listen to COVID Calls every weekday, Monday through Friday at 5 o'clock on YouTube Live. And you can always catch the podcast on SoundCloud. I want to thank my guests, Kate Marvel, Billy Fleming, and Franco Montalto for a really great hour. I said it would be an hour, and it's been an hour and 10 minutes. I think we could keep going. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing and for taking this time to have this conversation.
Thanks for organizing, Scott.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so it's fun.
Stay healthy, everyone, and we'll talk to you tomorrow at 5 o'clock.